Good morning and welcome everyone to the latest in the Willmott Property Series. My name is Nicola Seager and I'm a partner in the property litigation team here at Clarke Willmott. Before we start, I need to take you through some housekeeping points. Just very briefly, your microphone and video are automatically turned off, so you won't need to make any adjustments in your local settings. If we can ask you please to use the chat function on the right hand side of the screen. If you have any issues at all, technical issues, you can contact people behind the scenes. Likewise, please can you put questions in the chat function. We will try and take as many questions as we can at the end of the session. If you can pop them in the chat section, then we will pick them up, assuming we've got time towards the end. My duty today is to introduce you to our speakers. We're focusing today on property development issues. I'm delighted to welcome some first-timers to the CWPS and also to welcome back Mark Christie, who's debuted with us this time last year. Our first speaker today will be Adam Burrage. Adam is a partner in our commercial property team. He works out of our Taunton office. Adam specialises in residential development work and he acts on both sides of the landowner-developer fence, and his work stretches across the Southwest Peninsula. He frequently gets involved in promotion arrangements as well as general commercial property, freehold, leasehold sales and purchases. Today, Adam's going to be talking to us about modern methods of construction, or MMC. Joining Adam in that is Mark Christie. Mark is a senior associate in our construction team. He specialises in both contentious and transactional construction law. He's got a wide range of experience in all types of litigious and non-contentious matters, acting for a variety of clients. He acts for funders, developers, professional consultants, main contractors and subcontractors, so the list goes on. Regular attenders, as I say, will recall Mark joined us last year to talk about shortages post-pandemic and other issues affecting the construction industry. Today, he's joining Adam on the subject of MMC to give us the construction perspective. Once Adam and Mark have talked us through MMC, we'll be moving on to talk about restrictive covenants. Our presenters there are Naomi Cunningham and Caroline Mortimer. Naomi is a partner in the property litigation team. Her particular focus is development dispute work and ideally how to avoid disputes. As a mother of 3 girls and an owner of both cats and dogs, she gets plenty of practice at early intervention to avoid long-term problems. And last but by no means least, Caroline Mortimer. Caroline is also a partner in our commercial property team and again focuses on residential development matters, acting for both developers and landowners. Caroline joined Clarke Willmott last November from her previous position working in-house as head of legal at a house builder. So a different perspective for us perhaps. So anyway, without further ado, I will hand you over to Adam and Mark for MMC.
Okay, thanks Nicola and hello everyone. Welcome to this session. And MMC is what we're talking about first. So modern methods of construction. I think everyone knows what it is, and my aim really today is just to help play my part in leading a discussion about this and helping to raise the MMC profile and really encouraging everyone to think about it more, because in my view, certainly, it really is the future of house building. So really, we're talking about thinking outside the box here and considering anything other than traditional bricks and mortar build methods. So typically that means volumetric systems for entire units or timber panelized systems, which typically incorporate structural parts, insulation, services, and even finishes. Of course, there's steel and concrete systems as well. And really, it seems to have come to mean anything which is manufactured off-site and then brought to site for installation. And also there's hybrid systems where sub-assemblies are made off-site for certain elements and then dropped into a traditional build structure, which is quite helpful.
Thanks for that, Adam. So sounds like something that you're quite passionate about then. Why is it why is it that you're so passionate and care so much about MMC?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, to be honest, it's genuine, and it's quite personal for me. I'm basically a frustrated builder, pretending to be a lawyer during the day. And last year, I built a home office in the garden, which I'm sitting in right now. You can see some pictures of the construction on the screen. It's kind of become a kid's playroom, to be honest. But I built it via stick build, so I individually measured, cut, and screwed together every piece of wood, which was good fun, but it took me at least 10 times longer, I estimate, than if I'd craned in a bunch of panels. I didn't even have a nail gun at that point, so I screwed everything, so I could have saved time there, in fairness. Also, there's a picture there of my ongoing house renovation, without wishing to bore you, but that was stick build as well, so you can see the vast quantities of timber involved in the build, mainly because my main contractor is a chippy by trade, so he loves a stick build. But this is maybe two good examples here of people carrying on doing what they know and unfortunately being resistant to change, me included. So this all took a huge amount of time on site, but on the flip side, it means that the approach can be adapted with every cut to account for wonky walls and unexpected issues on site, which obviously is much harder to do with prefab systems, as you potentially compromise the structural integrity of the whole build if you start playing with these systems when you get to site. So my experience personally is probably just one of thousands of examples across the UK right now, where some kind of modular solution was probably the right choice in hindsight.
Great. So one of the kind of criticisms that I recall seeing when people are talking about MMC then, Adam, is that the builds are kind of cheap and it's basically just identikit buildings which get constructed in a kind of cheap manner. Would you think that that is a fair enough critique of the process?
I think that is a common view, but as I'll talk about shortly, we need to change the way we think about MMC and realise that it can be employed for bespoke builds and it's not just a cookie cutter, but we'll touch on that in a little while. I think it's probably fair at this point to talk about the pros and cons of MMC, because it's not like it's going to change overnight, and traditional build does still hold a lot of plus points. Probably everyone on the call is familiar with this list, so we won't dwell too much, but I'll just run through the pros of MMC first of all. The big one is the controlled environment of construction, typically in a factory, and you've got control over weather, which doesn't exist, temperature, light levels, so you can work later, which is maybe helpful, and mud, apart from anything else. Again, I've put some photos on here of my projects currently. They're a bit moved on from this now, I should add. Tarpaulins came to run my life for a little while. It was a constant battle to keep out the rain, and the tarps are good, but they're not totally effective. And the point here is that off-site construction mitigates the risk of negative impacts of weather. It's quite obvious, but really, it really is a big deal. You can never completely eradicate it. Obviously, structures are not watertight until a certain point. But again, from my recent experience, weather and mud are rarely your friend when your roof is half on and half off and you're at that really vulnerable point. The next positive is speed. Again, quite obvious, but nailing together panels and bolting together steel beams on site rather than measuring, cutting, moving and fixing everything one at a time is much faster. And speed is obviously good for all stakeholders involved, especially when you scale up the thinking here to 100, 200, 500 unit site, where you've got lots of stakeholders, buyers, local residents, council officers, and a multitude of contractors, all wanting to get on, get it done, and get off site as quickly as possible. Environmental impact, such a hot topic at the moment, rightly so. One example, bringing materials to site once rather than through multiple drops has to be an advantage, especially with the cost of diesel. And also there's less waste in factories, it's been proven, because it's easier to have an audit trail of all your materials going into the process. And there's also more room to separate your waste and recycle materials within the factory rather than just bunging everything into the skip. Cost, we always have to mention. Now, MMC builds have been shown to be cheaper in some scenarios. It's a typical lawyer answer probably, but it's not necessarily cheaper. I would highlight Grand Designs. There was an episode a few weeks ago where the build cost of an MMC project was 350k, which included all the groundworks and finishes, which is obviously good value for what was quite a large detached house with a cantilevered section over the front door as well. Finally, on the plus side, and I know Mark, you'll talk about this a bit later, using the JCT design and build contract is quite a good fit for MMC work. So it's a kind of a ready-made solution, as the customer has a one-stop shop for design, delivery and liability of the end product. Although there is a caveat, because this slightly crosses over with the warranty provision question, which is a big deal when it comes to these new systems, which are perhaps not tested to their full sort of working life because of the new tech. So just to be fair, on the flip side, I've already mentioned the sort of cookie cutter versus bespoke units argument. Typically, MMC is associated with multiple identical units being made in a factory, essentially boxed up and delivered to site, which works quite well for systems sort of designed at affordable housing schemes where you can have identical units rolled out next to each other in large numbers. Again, I'll mention Grand Designs. I'm not being paid by Kevin MacLeod, I should add, but an episode a few weeks ago shone a much needed light on the fact that MMC can be employed to produce one-off homes with architectural design and bespoke materials. And I think 2 of the 3 latest episodes have MMC elements. So it really is something that's coming to the front of construction, quite rightly. Just quickly on the rest, access and transport. Usually there's some issue with a big truck coming down a small lane. We've all seen it, but actually it's less relevant for site work because there's typically better access. So it makes sense for this tech to be rolled out in larger quantities. And quality is the other biggie. There's still skepticism around the quality of these systems. I spoke to Premier Guarantee 2 years ago, actually, about how they view these systems, and their biggest issues day to day are quality, really design defects which result in repeated failure of certain elements, and also systems coming from outside the UK not being properly tested and not quite coming up to the standard of UK accreditation. They also said, interestingly, that they are completely separate from BOPAS, the Build Offsite Property Assurance Scheme, but that potentially the accreditation systems for traditional and modular will overlap in the future. So that's a positive. Finally, secured lending. Mortgageability is always a big one. Again, there is a little bit of skepticism, especially in the current climate probably, to take risks on these new systems. The lenders look for structural integrity for 2 times the mortgage term. And obviously this is still very new, so there's no precedence. And essentially this is a niche pursuit in the eyes of many. Lots of articles talk about this being quite niche. And until we have much wider spread take-up of MMC, it will still be viewed as the underdog, I think. So I will hand over to Mark to talk about some actual legal stuff associated with the construction aspects of MMC projects.
Thank you, Adam. That was really interesting. Yes, as Adam's said, I'm going to fairly quickly cover some of the contractual and procurement issues which tend to rear their heads on MMC projects. So when we're actually talking about the contractual issues, it's probably important to go back to basics and understand that what we're trying to talk about here is allocation of risk on projects. And because of the fact that MMC is a relatively new concept within the industry. The main traditional methods of procurement and I guess the two standard forms, JCT and NEC suites of contracts, don't have a specific MMC based contract. So from a procurement perspective, the contractual side of things is a little bit behind where the industry might actually be. What that ultimately means is that at the outset of any MMC project, you're going to have to carry out some careful thoughts as to how to procure the works contractually. Adam mentioned helpfully that design and build was a decent fit for MMC, and he's absolutely right. The whole point of design and build, as most of you will know, is that you've got a one-stop shop for design responsibility and liability. And from an employer's perspective, you can see how that is the most attractive route to go down. The reality of the matter, however, is that you still need to consider whether the main contractor under a design and build scheme is going to be the MMC contractor, or whether it's wanting to subcontract the works out. And of course, if the majority of the turnover and risk associated with an MMC build lies specifically with one MMC subcontractor, you're going to find that quite a lot of main contractors are quite reluctant to take on board that risk. So that's a possibility why design and build might not be the appropriate procurement route to go down. The other main procurement route which tends to get bandied around when we're talking about MMC tends to be construction management, which many of you will be familiar with. So that's where basically you appoint a construction manager as the employer who's responsible for coordinating the works and managing them, as the name would suggest, and then the employer enters into direct trade contracts with the respective trades on the project. So that may well include entering into a bespoke contract with the MMC contractor. But I think regardless of what procurement route you go down, the normal types of issues which you need to consider when you're going down the MMC route are things such as warranties, risk of insolvency, title and vesting, and coordination and interface and programming issues, which aren't necessarily issues which are new to construction contracts, because they are obviously issues which you take into account on any construction project. But on MMC projects, those types of issues become really important. There are two kind of topics which I want to quickly touch upon. We've got the fitness for purpose obligations, which are quite rare to be found in normal construction contracts, but query whether, if you're using MMC and elements or large elements of the works are going to be manufactured off site in a factory, whether the fitness for purpose obligations, which are often resisted by contractors, might actually be appropriate, because basically you're asking them to design and basically construct some specific build requirements, and do you need that is going to be defect free and work when it's going to be delivered? Would the employer want to have a right to reject the goods if they're not suitable when they're delivered to site? Query, I guess, whether, rather than thinking about it like a construction contract, sometimes it might be more appropriate to think about it like a sales of good contract. So does the employer have the right to reject if it's delivered to site and it's out of spec? So you can see how that's quite different to how the traditional construction contract build would have been set up. The other topic which becomes more important in MMC projects is what's known as the design freeze philosophy. So as you can imagine, on an MMC project, you're going to need to have consultant input and employer sign-off of any design a lot earlier in the project than you normally might have. And that's quite obviously because the MMC contractor is going to be producing the materials in a factory off-site, more than likely. So issues to think about in your contracts for MMC: does the employer want a right to have samples and mock-ups sent over for sign-off? There needs to be clear dates for design approval and sign-off in the programme. Does the employer get a right to go and inspect the production and sign things off in the factory? How do you deal with things like insurance and risk and title? I guess the other thing to point out on MMC projects is that unlike traditional contracts whereby the contractor is likely to be issuing interim monthly applications for the values of works performed on site and built, under MMC contracts, the producer, should I say, will want to be paid a large amount of the money, if not all of it, up front to crack on and build it off site. So there's likely to be different payment mechanisms if you're going to be using the MMC route. I've mentioned title and vesting. That flows on from that point, really, because if an employer is going to be spending 80% or paying 80% of the price for something before it's even been delivered on site, they're almost certainly going to need to have title transferring on payment as opposed to delivery. So that's where things like vesting certificates become extremely important on these types of projects. The other final point I want to mention is to do with services and utilities, because whilst of course with MMC, when the units arrive fully fitted, they're not going to require the same level of construction fit out works on site that traditional build would. There still is going to require some kind of coordination and interfacing issues. For instance, each unit's still going to need connecting to the relevant services on the site: water, gas, broadband, electricity, etc., etc. So it's very important to understand which of the parties are responsible for liaising with the utility providers and making sure that those services are ready, basically, when the units arrive on site, because that's quite paramount ultimately to ensuring that you get the time-saving efficiencies that you'd hope to get from an MMC project. As you can imagine, if the units are delivered on site but nobody's properly coordinated the programs and it's just sat on site, you're very quickly going to be losing a lot of the speed and efficiency that you were hoping by going down this route. The final point is a bit of a technical and legal one, and that's to do with whether MMC contracts would amount to being construction contracts for the purposes of the Construction Act, which is an important question because it basically means that the payment provisions and adjudication rights which you get under the Construction Act are applicable to your MMC contracts. The answer can be found actually by section 105.2 of the Construction Act. So Adam did say that I was going to be talking about the dry legal elements here. So section 105.2 of the Construction Act makes it quite clear that manufacturing or delivery to site of components or equipment would be excluded as a construction contract unless that contract also provides for the installation. So it's probably worthwhile understanding at the outset precisely what the spec of works is under your MMC contract to understand whether it's going to be caught by the provisions of the Construction Act. So that was obviously a very quick run through some of the construction contract issues. I'm going to hand you back now to Adam.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, really interesting, and just highlights how many things there are to think about with this, which is probably why the whole world hasn't started using modular build quite yet. But it's all can all be addressed by way of risk allocation, I suppose. I'll just wrap up then by talking about what this all means for house building. So the impact on house building of using more MMC. Well, we still need 300,000 new homes a year, apparently. Last year, the actual figures, I think, were about 242,000. Year before was 216, I think. And MMC does really seem to have the potential to chew through a large chunk of that if the uptake increases. Now, how do we do that? Well, most people seem to write about MMC needing a more sort of specific focus in training, and apprenticeships, for example, need to really zone in on the specific skills needed for modular construction so that in months or years that feeds through to actual house building. So that seems to be a good place to start. There really is a reluctance to move first among developers, although some are bringing this into their mainstream now. which does mean progress is quite slow. But we personally are seeing local authorities increasingly taking risks on these kinds of projects, including custom build and self-build. I'm involved in a scheme at the moment near Newton Abbot, which hopefully will be a national showcase of this type of development. So, things are happening. So we just need to keep talking about it. Really, my message is let's just keep talking about MMC and kind of sharing ideas and being open to it as a principle in the industry, because I really do think this is the future of house building, and embracing it will allow us to sort of unlock opportunities in this new era. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Adam. Interesting stuff. Hi, I'm Naomi Cunningham. I've recently joined Clarke Willmott in the property disputes team, primarily focusing on development disputes and trying to avoid them where possible. And this is Caroline Mortimer. She's also a partner in the commercial property team, primarily dealing with development work as well. And together today, we're going to give you a quick refresher on restrictive covenants. Dealing with three main points. Firstly, what are they? Secondly, why do they matter? And thirdly, probably most importantly, what can you do about them? As part of this, we'll run through a couple of recent cases, one of which Clarke Willmott acted on, which provide some useful clarification in relation to some of the legal issues around enforcement. So to start off with, what are they? By way of a brief reminder, restrictive covenants are essentially agreements made between landowners that prevent certain uses, developments, activities on one piece of land for the benefit of another piece of land. An example might be a restriction against building more than one house on a site that could easily accommodate significantly more, or not to build on a certain part of the site, or not to use a plot of land for residential purposes. The law in relation to restrictive covenants is particularly dry, technical, complex, but in general terms, for a restrictive covenant to be enforceable, the covenant must touch and concern or somehow benefit other land. What that means in practice is that it can't just be a personal benefit to someone, or be designed to try and extract payment or secure a money obligation. It's also important to be able to identify the land that benefits from the restrictive covenant, which might sound obvious, but in practice it can be more challenging, particularly with old covenants. And I'll come back to this point shortly, because the recent case of Bathwood being Greenwood covers that issue in some detail. So now we know what they are. Why do they matter? Unfortunately, promising developments can be delayed or even prevented completely where it's discovered that the development site in question is subject to restrictive covenants. If you just try to develop without a restrictive covenant having been dealt with, you could be subject to a court injunction requiring the works to stop, and even be ordered to demolish anything that's already been constructed. You might alternatively face a significant award of damages, and of course there's the resultant delays that any enforcement action would cause. From a practical perspective, it's also unlikely that lenders will agree to lend on properties that are potentially subject to restrictive covenants without there being evidence that the risk of the covenant has been dealt with in some way. So now that everyone's terrified of restrictive covenants, there are fortunately things that can be done to mitigate the risks that are caused by their presence. And in practice, it's a combination of commercial and legal remedies. They can be summarised as 1, insure, 2, negotiate a release with the beneficiaries, 3, apply to the upper tribunal for a modification or discharge of the covenant, or 4, apply to court for a declaration that the covenant isn't enforceable. So starting us off with the most frequently used remedy in our experience, which is insurance. I'll hand over to Caroline, who's going to run through her experience of considerations around insuring covenants.
Thank you. Now, as Naomi says, the first protocol where there are restrictive covenants on the title which could be problematic from a development perspective is title insurance. And 99% of the time, that's the way to manage the risk because it's the most efficient, widely accepted and cost-effective way of dealing with the risk. So while we are going through the various methods today of dealing with covenants, from a practical perspective, please ensure you don't do anything, especially speaking with any potential beneficiaries of covenants, about those covenants before you've gone through the insurance route. Because what you don't want to do is cross off the possibility of getting title insurance before you even explored the possibility of it. Now, insurance will cover the risk of any covenants being enforced. So up to the policy limit, you'd be covered for cost of dealing with those covenants, which would most likely be through one of the avenues we're looking at today, and any reduction in value of the property. When it comes to what should be included within insurance, you need to make sure that the policy limit covers the whole gross developed value of the land, plus potentially a margin to cover any increases in value, and that it covers your lenders, your successors in title and their lenders, and if it's a development where you're installing services, it should also cover service providers. There are circumstances where insurance might not be available or might not be immediately available. You can get insurance on a pre-planning basis, but it's not guaranteed that you can, and it would be significantly more expensive than on a post-planning basis because the insurers use the planning process to flesh out any potential issues. If you can't get it pre-planning, you can get it post-planning. And if you have a conditional contract purchase where there are covenant issues, it's very usual to add a additional condition, the obtaining of satisfactory title insurance. There is still a commercial risk there that you need to assess because you've gone through the expensive planning process with no guarantee that you'll be able to get insurance at the end of it. But you can usually get a steer from the brokers as to whether they would be able to insure post-planning, subject to there not being any objections on a covenant basis that come out during the planning process. Because that's one of the main things that insurers look for, is whether anyone has made any objections during the planning procedures, claiming that they have the benefit of the covenant. So just a practical tip, particularly if you have a large development that is potentially attracting a lot of objections and you know you'll have to go to get title insurance, have someone keep an eye on those objections as and when they come in so you can keep a record of it, because it will save you a lot of time at the end when the insurance brokers say, can you please confirm that there have been no covenant objections? Once you've got the insurance in place, you again need to make very sure that you don't accidentally go and invalidate it by having any covenant-based conversations with potential beneficiaries. Now, if you can't get insurance, that's not necessarily the end of the road. There are other avenues to explore, and these are the avenues that the insurers would run down if there is a claim against the insurance because someone does pop up claiming a benefit. So I will pass back over to Naomi, who will tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you.
So if insurance isn't an option, say because the beneficiaries of the covenant have threatened enforcement action, it is possible to seek to negotiate an express release or variation of the covenant with the beneficiaries. As Caroline pointed out, you should only attempt this where you've already explored insurance, because if you tip off a beneficiary or a potential beneficiary before you've explored insurance, it may mean the covenant becomes uninsurable. You should also only attempt a negotiated release where you've verified that the covenant is enforceable or potentially enforceable. The full extent of the land that benefits from the covenant can be identified. All of the owners with the benefit of the covenant can be identified and located. and the proposed development will definitely breach the covenant. They all probably sound really self-evident, but the reason you would want to check these points before negotiating a release is because it's almost guaranteed that any release will be for a premium and potentially a significant one. And so if you're going to pay, you want to make sure that what you're getting in return for your payment is complete certainty and that the covenant isn't going to cause any issues. So what if you can't ensure, you can't negotiate a release? You're basically at this point left with the legal remedies, which are either apply to the upper tribunal for an order that the covenant is either modified or discharged, or if you think the covenant might be unenforceable, you can apply to court for a declaration to that effect. The reason the legal options are a fallback most of the time is because they obviously take a significant amount of time to pursue, they're very expensive, there's always uncertainty associated with any formal litigation. But it's still worth remembering that they're there as an option. In my experience, it's either end of the development spectrum that tend to resort to legal remedies, either very small developments or enormous developments that take several years of pre-planning. At this point, I'm going to hand back to Caroline, who's going to run through a couple of recent upper tribunal decisions, which are a helpful reminder about how to get covenants modified or discharged.
As Naomi says, it is possible to apply to courts to modify or discharge restricted covenants. And that, with the helpful slide that's up at the moment, is under section 84(1) of the Law of Property Act 1925. I won't go through it in whole because it is written in legalese from 1925, which is even worse than 2022 legalese. So, in short, there are 4 grounds on which the courts would modify or discharge. Ground A, that it's obsolete because the character of the property or the neighbourhood has changed. Ground AA, there would be a restriction in reasonable user of the land. It wouldn't be a great public interest and there is no securing of practical benefit of substantial value. Ground B, that the beneficiary has agreed to the covenants being discharged or modified. Just as a note for anyone who potentially does have the benefit of a restricted covenant, to make sure that you're not doing anything either expressly or that could be implied to be a release to avoid that ground. And then ground C, that the proposed discharge or modification would not injure the beneficiary of the restriction. The courts also have to take into account various other things such as development plans for the area, patterns for grants or refusals of planning, and ultimately looking at the original period and context where the restriction was imposed. Also under section 84(1), if you are successful and there is an order made for modification or discharge, there may be also an order made for compensation to make up for any loss or disadvantage suffered by the beneficiary. Now, there are 2 fairly recent cases which have come out on section 84(1), which is quite unusual because most of the time Naomi, bear with me on this one.
Resolved by negotiation?
Thank you. Most of the time, any cases are resolved by negotiation and settlement between the parties. Now, these cases are quite a useful flag for the current attitude of the upper tribunal, which can then feed into the negotiations. Now, the first case is called Hay Developments Limited and the Croft. The property in question, you can see edged red on the slide there. The applicant was a developer who had consent to develop 8 flats on the property edged red. Now that land is subject to covenants from 1955, not to use the land other than as a single dwelling house and not to cause any nuisance or annoyance. And those covenants benefited to the land called the Croft, helpfully marked the Croft on the slide. Now, when these covenants were imposed, the area was primarily large houses used for single family dwelling. That has changed. You can see from the plan there that the Croft in particular has been redeveloped as a number of individual blocks of flats. various other houses were also redeveloped into flats. Now, the applicant applied to discharge the covenants because it claimed they were obsolete, that the proposed use was reasonable and there wasn't any practical benefit secured. And the court found that the purpose of the covenants was to safeguard the character of the area, and the changes to the area meant that the purpose of the covenants was now superfluous. They also found there was no practical benefit secured. So, and we can really see here how each case very much hinges on the facts of each individual case. In this case, the benefits claimed were relating to overlooking and parking. And the courts decided that as the development had gone through the planning process and those matters had been dealt with by design and by planning conditions, realistically, there weren't issues that were likely to cause much problem for the occupiers of the croft. They also found there was not any reduction in value of the properties and no compensation would be needed. One of the things when you read the case that really does come out is the extent to which very good expert evidence is needed so you can prove what you're saying in terms of value, in terms of change of character. The court used one of the more polite smackdowns I've seen for a while in respect of the evidence given by the objector's expert, and I will read it in whole in case you want to adopt this language for yourselves. They said that the objector's expert was sceptical of the applicant's expert evidence of sale prices and bravely asserted that he was unimpressed by empirical evidence. The tribunal has to look at evidence objectively and prefers data to gut feeling. You can tell there's a certain amount of satisfaction that went into writing that as the judgment. The second case is called Millstrand Developments and Tap and Others, and that came out in July. The land in question edged red, the objectors on the land shown edged blue. Now, the land was subject to a restrictive covenant from 1972, which was not to erect any structures other than of an agricultural nature, and not use those structures other than for agricultural purposes. Now, the red line in this case had planning for construction of 5 residential units, and they applied to discharge the covenants on the basis the proposed use was reasonable and there was no practical benefit secured. Now, the objectors claimed the benefit was the preservation of visual amenity because they had an uninterrupted view of the rural area. As the covenant permitted agricultural buildings, I'm not entirely sure why it would have been fine to erect a huge, massive agricultural shed and not 5 dwellings, but that's what they claimed. And the court found actually that development was a reasonable use for the land because it had gone through the planning process, but there was some practical use for the benefits in securing that uninterrupted view. Now, that's interesting that there is no right for review during the planning process, but apparently there is when the court's considering restrictive covenants. But the court also thought in this case, if the land wasn't developed, it would turn into, quote, unattractive scrubland, and therefore the covenants should be modified. There was £25,000 compensation awarded, and the covenant itself modified so that the specific permitted development would be allowed under the covenants with renewals or modifications by the planning process. So it really does show that of late the courts have been taking a very pragmatic and practical approach to considering covenants, particularly in the upper tribunal. Modification and discharge is not the only route forward. There is an alternative route, which Naomi is.
Yeah, court declaration. So probably your last option really, and to be used where you think the covenant might not be enforceable. You can apply to court for a declaration to that effect under Section 84 of the Law of Property Act. The recent Court of Appeal decision in Bath, Rugby and Greenwood is interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, because Clarke Willmott were involved successfully, and secondly, because it helped clarify the law in relation to the point I made earlier about the need to be able to clearly identify the land that benefits from a restrictive covenant The brief facts of this case are that Bath Rugby had applied for a declaration that a covenant from 1922 was unenforceable because, in simple terms, they said that the land with the benefit of the covenant couldn't be identified. The club were looking to replace their stadium with a new larger stadium, but it was going to be over land that was subject to a restriction preventing use that might cause a nuisance or annoyance. The High Court at first instance had decided that the land was sufficiently identifiable with the effect that the covenant would have been enforceable and prevented the club's expansion plans. However, the decision was appealed to the Court of Appeal, where Clarke Willmott also became involved, acting on behalf of the intervener, Bath Recreation Limited, who were the freeholder of the land that was leased to Bath Rugby and co-appellant in the claim together with the club. Without going too far into the technicalities of the various requirements for a covenant to be enforceable, restrictive covenants are generally binding between the original parties because they'd be enforceable in contract. But once the land is transferred, there is always the question of whether the covenants will still be binding on any future owners. And for the 1922 covenant to still be enforceable in the Bath Rugby case, the land with the benefit of that covenant had to be identified. And in order for that to happen, it needed to be annexed to the land. There was, however, no plan attached to the 1922 conveyance, which just referred to adjoining land or the neighbourhood. The High Court found that what adjoining land or neighbourhood meant could be determined by reference to other documents, such as lists held by the estate that used to own the land. However, the Court of Appeal ultimately disagreed and found that the phrase adjoining premises or neighbourhood was too uncertain. It wasn't clear that it referred to land owned by the seller at the time, and it wasn't possible to draw up a plan of what the neighbourhood was. So the Court of Appeal found in favour of the rugby club and the freeholder and held that the restrictive covenant wasn't enforceable. The case is a good reminder that even if a covenant appears on a title, it may still not ultimately be enforceable. So to wrap up restrictive covenants, I think mine and Caroline's takeaway message would be that you can't ignore them. But if they do crop up, it's not the end of the world. It's not necessarily the end of the development. There are things that can be done to mitigate the risk so that the development can still proceed. It's just important that you come to us early so that we can review all of the options at the earliest possible stage, avoid the pitfalls of tipping off beneficiaries, and come up with a plan of action. And hopefully that's been helpful.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Thank you to all four of our speakers for the topics today. In terms of questions that have come in, I'm not sure whether it's user error on my part, but I can't find any questions on my screen at the moment. I don't know if any of our other speakers have had questions directed to them. If there are no questions, or it's just a technical error on my part, we'll obviously, if people want to email questions in after the event, we can record them and send them back to you if that is of assistance.
Hi Nicola, it's Mark. I got a question in the question and answer section, which I've responded to in writing actually. So yeah, that's been done now.
Okie doke. Anyone got any they'd like to share with the wider audience, or if not, we'll wrap things up there. Obviously, if anyone's got any questions that you want to raise individually with any of the speakers, then obviously please do after the event. We will be circulating the recording and slides as usual, so you'll have contact details for everybody if you want to get in touch. And obviously, we'd love to hear from you. there will be a short feedback survey as well circulated after the event, again, as ever. If you are able to fill that in and send us any comments, we're grateful for that. We're always particularly interested in topics you'd like us to cover for future events. We do the best we can to pick up on the things that are of interest and use to you. And in general terms, the next webinar, I think, will be in the new year. So we will be sending you details of that in due course, and hope to see many of you then. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you to Georgia and Vicky behind the scenes for the admin, which is invaluable to me with my technical ineptitude in particular. And thank you to everyone for attending, and see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.